Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I'm a Premier Field Engineer specializing in system-centered technologies. Today's discussion is part 2 of an ongoing series discussing software updating in Configuration Manager 2012. Part 2 is going to build on part 1 and talk about the server configuration of software updates. So in part 1, we spent some time doing an overview of software updates and talking about some of the new changes coming in R2 and things, but we didn't drill into specific strategy and different things related to software updates. Today, we're going to do a bit of discussion around that. Some of the things that you're going to see today will be similar to what you saw in part 1, but the goal of today's discussion is to talk about how we would use these components of software updating and different things, right? So we'll focus today, this session, on more the ongoing administration of software updates on the server side. And then as we continue along in the series, we're going to go behind the scenes on the server side and understand how things work there, move to the client side, the user's experience of deploying software updates, what they would see, go behind the covers on the client side as well. And then we'll end up the series talking about some ways to automate software updates. I'll touch on that a bit as we go through, right? So really the things that I want to hit today is to talk about the software update point. Software update point is a critical role for software updates, obtaining updates, scanning for updates, that kind of thing. Again, with an eye toward the server side use of the software update point. Then talk about configuring and deploying updates. Again, some strategy discussion mainly in focus for that. Talk about some monitoring, how we kind of track the ongoing success of software updates. Then I do want to hit a couple of client experience items, which those are going to be those client experience items that you really can configure on the server side. There will be one that we look at on the client, but mostly those that we can configure on the server side. So that's it. Let's just jump right into it and start talking about the software update point. So in terms of the software update point, two buckets I want to talk about. The first are the configuration options for the software update point, specifically those that are available in Config Manager 2012. Certainly, there are some configuration options that have been around since Configuration Manager 2007. I really won't hit those, but I'll hit the new ones, and we'll just talk about them here. Then I'll show them to you in the console, right? So there are three major things that I want to talk about. A couple of them showed up in Config Manager SP1, and really all three of them showed up in Configuration Manager SP1. Sorry, two of the three showed up in Configuration Manager 2012 SP1. The other one was at RTM. So we'll start with the one at RTM, which is supersedence. Right. So supersedence describes how we treat updates that we sync, and specifically the scenario where a new update that is synchronized in from Microsoft Updates supersedes one that is already in our database. So the way that we did that by default, or the only option we had for that in 2007, and the way we did that by default, I believe, in 2012 RTM, was to simply expire the update that we're superseding. So if a new one shows up, then we'll expire the one that we're superseding so it can no longer be deployed. Well, that presented a problem for a number of customer environments who might have a longer change control process. So we might release, for example, an update in July, and they'll go through the change control process, start to get approval for deploying that, and maybe they don't get approval to deploy that until middle August, right? But then in August, Patch Tuesday, we would release an update that superseded the one that they had already started through the approval process for. Well, the end result for the customer would be that we would expire the one in July, the one that they're trying to get approved. They couldn't deploy it because we have now superseded it and replaced it, right? Well, so now we give you the choice, and I'll show that to you so that you can decide, if we supersede an update, whether you want to immediately expire it like we do by default, or whether you want to give some sort of grace period, like 2 or 3 months before we expire it, right? So I'll show that to you. So that was an RTM. The other two were introduced in Service Pack 1, and that one, one of the two, is to synchronize Microsoft updates from an internal Microsoft Update server. So typically, whenever we synchronize software updates at the top level, whether that be a standalone primary or a CAS or whatever, we would have two choices: either to go to the internet an internet-based Microsoft update to download our updates that we've selected and approved. Or we would have the ability to manually import those updates that we had selected from maybe another WSUS server somewhere. And that worked. People used it very successfully. Answered both the option of internet connected and non-internet connected deployments of ConfigMgr, right? But in some cases, there might be environments that have multiple ConfigMgr hierarchies, or might just want to have a single WSUS source that they can establish for the enterprise and let that be the source for Microsoft updates, syncing rather than going across the internet. So it could be that those maybe disconnected environments want to have kind of a centralized WSUS server they can go to, whatever the reason. But we now allow that in Service Pack 1 to specify your own WSUS server that the central or the CAS or the standalone primary site will go to as its authoritative sync source versus going to Microsoft updates. Again, I'll show you where you configure that. And then thirdly, we introduced in Service Pack 1 the ability to have multiple software update points per primary site. So in Configuration Manager 2012, our scale for a primary site is really no different than 2007. We can support 100,000 clients per primary site. But the real limitation historically has been that in order to reach that scale, you would need multiple management points, multiple software update points. When we answered the management point problem in RTM, where we allow you to have multiple management points without the use of network load balancing. In RTM, though, we still require network load balancing if you have more than one software update point. So now in Service Pack 1, we remove that dependency on network load balancing and let you scale to more than one software update point simply by installing it. And so really the need for multiple software update points, one of two, either for scale or for redundancy and failover. So if you do have a software update point that fails scan or you're having problems with, even if you don't have a scale issue, you might want another software update point that can be accessed, scanning proceed, and then the software update deployment is able to proceed without problem. So that's another reason you might want to have one. And again, I'll show you those options where you set them here in a moment. So the other thing that I want to mention in terms of software update points is the idea of synchronization. Right? So in order for software updates to be deployable in ConfigMgr, you need to be able to synchronize those software updates. Okay? So I want to talk about generally the flow and some of the changes in 2012 that we just discussed and how they the impact is on the flow. Really, the flow isn't hugely different than what we had in 2007, but I want to show it to you. Then I want to talk about the different types of synchronizations, full, delta, them scheduled versus manual, and how all those work. Again, not a ton there, but worth knowing. So in terms of the synchronization flow, I've got a hierarchy of sorts diagrammed on the screen. I've got a CAS up here and then two child primaries. On the CAS, I have a software update point. Okay. On the child primary, I have a software update point. And on this child primary, I have two software update points. I actually have, it looks like four, but I have two. I'm just showing two different ways that you can configure multiple software update points, which I'll describe in a minute. And the goal of this, again, is to walk through the flow. So whenever you synchronize software updates from the internet or whatever to the CAS, how that information flows through to your hierarchy, to your site servers, ultimately to your child software update points, and so on. So I've got it kind of numbered out here in terms of the flow. So whenever you synchronize updates in Configuration Manager 2012-2007 for that matter, it's really a two-step process to obtain and provision the updates in both the WSUS database software update point and the Configuration Manager database. So you see that by the way I'm numbering these things out. I'll show you this process in the log here in just a minute. So the very first process is very first step is for the Config Manager site server to request the WSUS server or software update point to go synchronize updates. So when that request is made, this software update point will go to its upstream sync source, which could either be a standalone WSUS server that you have in the environment. That's, again, one of the new options we talked about a minute ago that's in SP1. Or it could be Microsoft updates on the internet. Whichever one you've chosen is fine. It could also be offline, too, for completion, but anyway, so here we're going to go to the sync source and start to synchronize the updates. Notice the double arrows here showing that there's information flow back and forth, right? We're going to go ahead and sync those updates into our WSUS database. You're going to find this to be the shortest step of the two-step process. Once we have this, then step 3 kicks in, and we have to copy, if you will, the metadata that we pulled from the internet or from our upstream source and copy it over to the ConfigMgr database. This copy is really a transformation, if you will, into the configuration item structure that Configuration Manager needs to be able to deploy these updates. Right? So you might ask the question, why do we have to synchronize this information twice? Well, the first time is actually to get it into the WSUS database so we can use it for scanning on clients and different things that the WSUS server itself, the software update point, is used for. The second one is to transform it, as I mentioned, into configuration items that we can place into the Configuration Manager database. That information is used for knowing how to deploy these updates and such through the Configuration Manager infrastructure. Okay, so then we have step 4. Step 4, once we finish the synchronization at our top-level site, again, the CAS or standalone primary. If you have standalone primary, the only child sites you could have are secondaries, so still you'd have to replicate the data down to those software update points, but the diagram would look a bit different. So in a hierarchy, we would have finished the process synchronizing at our CAS, and once we're done, we would realize we have a number of child primaries that we need to synchronize the updates to. And so we will begin that process of synchronizing the updates down. Right? So if we just have one software update point, pretty easy. Right? It would be a little bit of a lengthy process depending on how much you have to move, right? Because we would have to move the same data that we have up here on down the chain. Or it could be a couple of step process depending on if we have more than one software update point at a site. So let's just talk about this, the first example first. So I have, in this example, 2 software update points, and you notice each one has a unique database. So in a site, whenever you have more than one software update point, one of them is going to take the primary role, the lead role, right, at that site, and be the initial one that gets the software update synced down to it. Once we get the information in one database, then we'll synchronize it across to the other one, right? So it could take, time to get it all the way around to all the software update points within a site. Okay, but that's the way it works. So there's advantages to this model. There's disadvantages, length of time, whatever. But then we have the second model, right? So the second model is the same thing. We have 2 software update points, but notice they have a shared database. So whenever we synchronize the updates down to this software update point, it's the main one, then we'll let the other one know that it's got work to do to synchronize, but then we'll look in the database and realize, hey, everything is already there. We're sharing a database, so there's no reason to move the data around again. The nice thing about this one is we just have one database that we're trying to maintain the updates in, perhaps a bit faster. It is faster, right, since we only have one database to store the info in. But the downside of this is if that database goes down or is inaccessible for some reason, then neither one of the software update points are going to work. Whereas in the first model, where each has its own database, if one goes down, the other one is available and can process. Right, so it's really up to you which one you want to use. Both are equally valid options. They just have their own unique advantages and disadvantages. All right. So by the way, if you want to understand more about the way that we treat software update points, multiple software update points within a site, then I wrote a blog on that you can go to here. Let me pull that up. Okay, so here it is on my blog, just a way to go through and look at what it takes to configure multiple software update points, what to expect during synchronization. I walk through the log entries you'd see here. Pretty short, so if you want to read through it, it's here if you want to take a look for reference. All right, so let's talk about the sync a bit more. So in terms of the synchronization itself, there are 2 types of syncs that can happen: a full synchronization and a delta synchronization. So typically these are very similar, but there is a difference slightly between them. So a full synchronization is one that will have an opportunity to identify and repair software updates that have problems from previous synchronization attempts. Maybe there's been damage. Maybe you've had some deletion that's happened with some of the data needed for that software update. So the full sync will actually go through and have a chance to repair those items. By contrast, the delta sync will not do that. So it has no option to go through and repair updates from a previous synchronization attempt. Right? Now, you really don't have a ton of control over which synchronization is chosen. You kind of do, but there's not really a switch to say go do a full sync, go do a delta sync, right? So it's really whether to use a full sync or a delta sync is really decided based on a few items. So, for example, if you're switching to a different default software update point, then we'll trigger a full synchronization, right? Also, if you go through and change the subscription detail, like the categories you're subscribing to, the products, whatever, then we'll go through and we'll trigger a full synchronization. In addition, if you make changes to the supersedent settings, again, I'll show you these in a minute, then that will trigger a full synchronization, right? And there's also a site control file setting about the full sync interval. We really shouldn't mess with that, but it's basically after a certain number of synchronizations, we'll go ahead and trigger a full sync, right? So really, you do have some impact on triggering a full sync if you want to. You could go change, for example, your subscription detail. You could go change your supersedent settings or whatever to cause a full sync to get triggered, but there's not a switch per se to say do a full sync, do a delta sync, right? So if we let's go ahead and pull the lab in for a minute here and show what it looks like in the log, some triggers that you can look at to indicate that a full sync has happened. Let me drop this out of the view, go into software updates log here. I'll just go into manual sync. All right. So let's scroll up to the beginning of the sync cycle on 710. There we are. Yeah, I went way past it. That's all right. Let's just scroll down a bit and find it. Getting close. And on we go. Okay, here we are. So basically we see a request to synchronize, right? And then notice one of the first lines is full sync required due to changes in category subscriptions. So that's one of the ways I just mentioned that you can actually trigger a full sync. We have found one software update point. And then I also want to illustrate to you in the logs, I mentioned this is a two-step process, right? The first step is to ask the software update point of the WSUS server to synchronize itself against Microsoft updates or your upstream WSUS server. And the second step is to synchronize from the WSUS server over to the ConfigMgr database. So here we see that we are synchronizing the WSUS server and synchronizing it here, starting the synchronization. And then we'll go through and just find all the different items that we need to sync. Also new in the logs is the time left for the synchronization. So this is nice because before it would just run and run and run, and you'd never really have an idea how much longer it had. At least I believe, as I recall, compared to 2007, that's new. And then we're done, right? So we're done synchronizing the WSUS server, but we're not done with the sync. The next thing is to synchronize the SMS database with the WSUS server, and that's where you start to see us run through and configure categories and just roll through all these updates. In fact, if you scroll through the rest of this log, pretty much the rest of it is all the synchronization we're doing to move or to copy the data from the WSUS server and transform it into configuration items stored in the Configuration Manager database. Right? So hopefully that helps understand kind of the end-to-end processing that goes on. All right. So now there's also a couple of different ways that you can initiate the sync, scheduled or manual. Let me pull that back in and show it to you. Pretty easy, but let's just make sure. So if we go to Software Library and go to All Software Updates, right-click, you can manually synchronize the software updates, or you can go use the scheduled scan, which you configure on the software update point properties itself. So let's go look at that. So if I go under Administration, and then go under Sites. So this is a hierarchy, so I'll look at the CAS and go under Configure Site Component Software Update Point. And here's where I see the various options available to me for configuration. So one of the new options for synchronization location, here's where I can specify the upstream WSUS server, the classifications and products that I've had around for a while, the sync schedule, whether I want a custom schedule, daily schedule, whatever, this is the scheduled sync. The supersedence rules, so I'm just using the default supersedence rules, but this is where you would change it if you want to impact what you're doing here and how this operates, right? And then also language. So a lot of these are persistent from Configuration Manager 2007, but there are a few tweaks in here. All right. Now, in terms of again the way that you initiate the sync, it really doesn't matter so much the way you initiate it, whether it's a scheduled or a manual sync. Will do the same things. In fact, if you look further down in that log, you'll be able to see that we'll after we finish the sync, whether we're doing a manual or a scheduled or whatever, we're going to go through and clean up updates that are expired and we need to remove from the database and different things, right? So the way you initiate isn't so pivotal. All right, so let's move on. Oh, there's the demo. Move on here. So now we get to the concept of deploying updates again. We went over this a bit in brief in part 1 of the series, but I want to go over this again with the eye toward strategy, right? So I want to walk through some strategy and thoughts around the software update group, some deployment package discussion, and how to consider the deployment package. Talk about the automated deployment rules a bit, maintenance windows, right? Just one quick thing there. Another thing I'll mention here before I get into the demo. So certainly with Configuration Manager 2007, 2012, even 2003, we've had the ability to deploy Microsoft updates, and that list of products that we can deploy updates for and the types of updates and different things has grown over time, but still the only options out of the box are Microsoft-centric updates. Well, how cool would it be if you could deploy non-Microsoft updates, right? So maybe you have a homegrown application that you want to use the Config Manager approach to deploy those updates. Very doable with an add-on tool called System Center Updates Publisher. It's not at an extra expense. It's free to anyone using Configuration Manager in their environment, and definitely worth the look, right? So if you have a need to deploy updates to firmware, Dell and HP and so on, there's actually some inbuilt catalogs that you can leverage to immediately take advantage of that. But third-party updates, if you want to craft those into a structure that you can deploy through Config Manager, that's very doable as well. So definitely take a look. It's something that I've seen a lot of customers find value in, but a number of customers look at it and they're kind of put off because it is to get beyond the catalog, it is a bit of manual work. The nice thing about it in Config Manager 2012 is there's a bit of similarity, not total, but a bit of similarity between System Center Updates Publisher and the work needed to do in the application model. So once you learn the application model, you're pretty comfortable, I would think, with the approach of building updates in System Center Updates Publisher. Right, so take a look. The other thing is, again, when we think of software updates, we think of handling Windows updates, and that's certainly true. With now the ability for Config Manager 2012 to natively install on Unix, Linux, even Mac, right? Now we have the ability to extend Config Manager's use to patching those platforms as well. One thing to note, those platforms don't understand the Windows style of updating, so they don't have a concept of a WSUS server. They don't have a concept of patches coming from Microsoft Update and such. So you would need to use packages to update those platforms, but still it's very possible to do with Config Manager, and you can use a single tool to make it happen and leverage your skills for updates with those platforms as well, right? So enough about that. The rest of the time I want to spend on this topic anyway, walking through the strategy portion of the software updates node. So let's go over to software library for a minute. So here's the software updates node, and the very first node is all software updates. So you'll notice this is your first time to really pay attention to the software updates node, that there is no tree structure here like you're accustomed to in Configuration Manager 2007. There's a single view that provides insight into all of the updates. So you can find and filter the ones that you want with add criteria. There's a whole bunch of different criteria you can put in here, including product or criticality or whatever else makes sense. Right? You can add multiple update filters and different things to scope what you want in this view. Right? Notice that we stop at 1,000 updates in a single view. If you want to go beyond that, you can click this bar and we'll bring in even more updates, but that's just more of a performance thing than anything else because it takes a while to list out the various updates. Right? In here, you can actually go through and see details about the update and all sorts of different things that you'd expect. So you can right-click, go to Properties, see details on the update, max runtime, different things, right? Set a custom severity, see your supersedence information, whatever. You could also go and deploy these updates. So, for example, if I wanted to right-click and download or deploy the update or whatever, I can do that from here. Right? Nothing to prevent me. The better strategy is to actually deploy updates as part of a software update group. You can do it here, but software update group is the right way or the better way. Right? So let's just move to software update groups for a minute. So there's a number of ways that I've seen folks use software update groups. Right? One not uncommon approach that I've seen in many environments can actually lead to problems, which is why I want to call it out, is where you have a single software update group for the current month of patches, and then maybe a maintenance software update group for the rest. So let me give an example. Say that we have, we're in July maybe, right? And we want to build a software update group that uniquely will deploy all of the updates for July. And then anything that is historical, meaning previous to July, we'll have as part of another software update group that contains everything that we're keeping, maybe a year's worth or of patches, whatever the case may be, right? Well, you can do that. It's very simple to think about. So your July patches, maybe think of having Windows 7 patches and Windows 8 patches and Server 2012 patches and Office patches and all the patches that you would want to deploy. You can put in the July software update group, and then you can deploy that to all the systems in your environment. That works, right? The ConfigMgr client is smart enough to be able to figure out, hey, I'm a Windows 8 system, I don't need this Windows 7 patch, or I'm a system that doesn't have Office, so I don't need this Office patch, and just discard it or not install it, right? That's great. Here's the problem with that, right? So with any deployment, really, not just software updates, but any deployment, you really want to focus your target list to only those folks that you know need it. So, for example, in this example, it's just one example. It's better not to target Windows 8 systems with Windows 7 patches. It's better not to target Windows 7 patches with Windows 8 patches, right? Because you're just making that system process through patches that you know it's not going to need. Right? The same way, it's better to not target Office patches at systems that you know don't have Office, because you're just making those systems process patches you know that they're never going to need. So, and here's the rub too, right? Every patch you deploy, or every item, if you will, even non-patches you deploy to a system that you know it's not going to need it, it's just going to increase the space required on that system to store patches, maybe the space in the WMI repository to retain information about those patches, and so on. So it's just generally not a good idea. So the way I like to break it down is to have a software update group per operating system. Now, you could go really, in detail and get granular and say, okay, well, there's a software update group for Windows 7.NET. There's a software update group for Windows 7 x86, a software update group for Windows 7 x64, and on we go. And you can get very granular. I don't really see a need for that. I suppose you could do it that way, but I want to keep targeting the systems that I know that system is at least a candidate possibly for a patch that I'm sending to it. Right? And then the system can figure out from there which one's in the group that it needs. It just helps scope down the target audience a bit. So, and as I go through this, there's just so many strategies about how you could do this that people use, and there's no one right answer. There are certainly some red herrings that can come up as you go through this. It really is what's right for your environment, factoring in some of the best practices to make sure you stay out of the potholes, so to speak. So let me show you what I've done. I've set up some examples in my lab, and I'm going to show these to you. And as I go through them, I want to have you look at it and see, if there's anything that jumps out at you about what I've done, right? So I'll just start at the top. So notice I have my security updates for Office 2013, and I have a deployment targeted, and I've sent it to all managed systems for software updates. So in all managed systems, I'm going to have a variety of systems. I'm going to have a couple of Linux boxes, a Windows 8 box, a XP box, a few Windows 2012 boxes, right? And all in that in the collection that's being targeted by the deployment. Okay, so then I have security updates for Windows 7. For the deployment here, I'm simply targeting a collection called Windows 7 for software updates, meaning the only systems in this collection are those Windows 7 systems that I know would need to receive updates. Then I have the same thing, Windows 8 security updates targeted just to Windows 8 systems. I have a Windows 8 maintenance collection here. I've not, or software update group I haven't deployed yet. I didn't create maintenance groups for everything. I just put that there to give you an idea of what it might look like. So in general, you're going to have, right, a software update group for maintenance maybe per category, and then an ongoing deployment, monthly updates group for the current updates, right? So you might have a number of these for your environment, even more than what I have here. That may seem unwieldy at first. We'll talk about that in a minute, right? Because it can get unwieldy if you do this stuff manually, but it's quite manageable if you do it in an automated fashion, right? Then we have the Server 2012 software update group, and it's targeted to just Server 2012 systems, and the spelled software there. Same for XP. And then I have I pick Bing Bar, right? And I'm targeting it to all managed systems. And then this one is from something else I'm working on, right? So just walking through that, the question is, do you see anything kind of odd about what I've done? And since we can't really discuss it, right, I'll go ahead and tell you what two things I kind of built into this. Notice the red X, the color of the icon, or the icon used for a software update group. If there's something, if there's an icon that's green, it means you're good to go. Everything's fine in the software update group, ready to be deployed. Not a ton of maintenance to do here. Yeah, it may be some. You might need to move some things around or whatever, but not a ton of maintenance. If you have a yellow or a red, or in this case a red X in a couple of cases on your software update group, that means there's some problem with the software updates of the group. So let's just go into here and look. So if I double click on this group, it's going to show me that 3 of the updates are just fine, but there's 2 of them that are expired. So if I click on it, it's going to say yes, expired, and this one also is expired, right? So what this means, just at a glance, I can see that there's software update groups that need maintenance to be performed on them. So as you manage software updates, you're going to need to factor in maintenance on those software updates to make sure your system stays clean, that you're deploying the latest updates, that you're getting rid of or removing from the deployment updates that are expired and different things, right? So these 2 would be eligible to be removed from my software update group, and then everything would go back green, okay? And then I have another group down here where the same thing is in place. I have another red X down here, so I can look at it for Windows Update, Windows 8 maintenance. I've just got a couple in here. There's an X on it, right? And I can tell that it's expired and superseded, right? So you notice the other one was just expired, which made it have a different color or different look to the X. And here it's both expired and superseded, which causes a different icon, right? So you can see at a glance what's going on. Now, one other thing that was a bit more subtle as I went through this that I want to call out is notice up here the software update group here. My Office software update group is deployed to all managed systems for software updates. What this means is that every system in my environment potentially is going to get the deployment for this software update. Well, what if these systems don't have Office, right? Well, we're causing the system to process software updates that we know are never going to apply. So it would actually be better to have a collection of systems that have Office. It's very easy to build a collection of systems that have Office and let this go out to that group of systems, right? So it's a trade-off. You even see it in the application model where we can offload to the client some checking. The requirement rules, as an example, can be checked by the client before it deploys an application. You can certainly offload processing to it, and you will want to do that in some cases, and then minimize the number of collections that you use on the site server. Same Same thing here, right? That's what I mentioned when I said you don't really need to get so granular that you're targeting, x86 separate from x64 for a single operating system. You don't need to go in and split up and have .NET versus, whatever else it is on a particular operating system. You can put them together, but just try to limit your scope as much as possible, right? Another thing that I saw happen with a deployment at a customer site is that they would actually deploy to a collection that had all ConfigMgr client systems in that collection. Well, that was well and good, and the client should, again, sort out which updates it needs and which ones it doesn't, and just process those that it needs. But one thing they'd failed to do is factor in inactive clients, ones that hadn't reported for a while, some of the garbage they had in their environment because their Active Directory wasn't clean, and different things. So in that case, they were all listed. All the clients were listed as ConfigMgr clients, but there were a number that said inactive. Well, what was happening is that their hit rate, their success rate on software updates was down around 82, 81%. And as we started looking, it was because a significant number of these systems were listed as inactive. So there was never a chance that we were going to succeed there. And so what we did is we pulled those inactive systems out of the collection, made sure the membership for the collection factored in that we only want active ConfigMgr clients, and then immediately almost the hit rate went up to around 95, 96% just by pulling those out. Right? Now, that's a bit of a smoke and mirrors game, right? Because you do want to factor in all of the systems in your environment that should be targeted. Certainly there will be client issues that show up and different things that will need to be fixed and such in your environment to make sure the client's able to receive these updates. But you don't want to mask those systems from being found out, but you definitely don't want to factor in garbage machines, ones that you know are never going to succeed, and ones that you would never expect to succeed into a collection either. So again, bit of a balancing act there, but worth discussing. All right, another thing here just to show is in our software update group here as well, right? You can add in a column called CI Unique ID. You'll see it here. It's not here by default. So if I go in, for example, to Office 2013 and right-click, you'll see this Unique Update ID down here. The other CI Unique ID, here's an Update ID. Point of this is every ConfigMgr update in the system and a number of other things as well are referred to by a unique ID, an update GUID, if you will, right? In essence, these items are unique configuration items in the system. Software updates is one of several places that configuration items are used, and the whole reason I point this out, it's not here in the console by default, but as we get to the client side and start looking at the logs on the client side, what you're going to find is the system refers back to the update by ID far more than it refers to it by friendly name. So if you know where to find the ID, it just makes your troubleshooting experience easier on the client side, right? And even in some places on the server side. So I call that out. Don't have to have it there all the time. You can definitely put it there, and there's other options here that might make sense for you as well to have as columns if you want them, right? So pretty easy to add. Now, another thing here that I want to show is how easy it is. Talked about maintenance that needs to be done on your software update groups and such. Well, say that I know that these updates are expired, and I want to move them to a group of expired updates, maybe. That, in fact, let me just do this and show you, right? So I'm going to just create. This is a little bit of smoke and mirrors here as well. But let me just say expired software updates. So maybe I want to have a software update group here that I can just see what all the expired updates are that I've moved out of my active groups and so on. So I have expired software updates up here. I'm going to go remove the updates from this list that I just put in there. So I'll be left with just the container. Right. So edit membership. Well, I'll just show it to you. So let's go back in here. So let's say that I have this one, right? And I know that there's some expired software updates in here, so I can go into the software update group and I can say, these are expired. I don't want them in here. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to edit my membership. And what I'm going to do is say this one wasn't selected. then I can say move this over to the expired software updates and move it out of here, and immediately it's just going to get rid of it, right? So I can go update this again, and it should be gone, right? So I can go, I'll put it back because I want to put it there. But I show you that because I want you to see how easy it is to actually maintenance these items. There was really nothing as easy like this in Configuration Manager 2007. So this is a nice little window to be able to have. Well, whatever, I'll leave that alone. Good enough. Okay. So let's see. Yeah, there's another option I'll show you in just a minute on the deployment itself, but let's move on and talk about deployment packages, which is next in the list. So the question here on the table, first of all, you see that I have a couple of deployment packages. Well, let me explain deployment packages real quick for those where this might be new. Whenever we set up a deployment historically, maybe a package, maybe in Configuration Manager 2007, what we think of doing is we create a package, and then as part of creating the package, we stage the content for that package on a distribution point. So whenever a client goes to access the content for that package, it goes to just the content associated with that package on the distribution point, runs the deployment, all's good, right? And that works well. Well, with software updates in 2007, what we did is we disassociated the deployment package and the actual software update deployment, which means simply this. You might have 10 different software update deployments, but only 2 or even 1 deployment package. The point of it is the actual deployment of software updates is not linked to a specific deployment package. All that's required is that the software updates referenced in the software update deployment exist in at least one software update deployment package that is on a distribution point accessible by the client. Right? We did that on purpose because in 2007 we introduced the concept of selective download. So if you have a big, massive deployment package, maybe 5 gigs, right? But the client only needs about 500 megabytes worth of content from that deployment package, all it's going to do is identify that 500 meg and download it versus the entire 5 gig, right? If you had content, that 500 meg of content was in place across a couple of different deployment packages, that's fine too. We'll get 200 meg from one deployment package, 300 meg from the other. As long as we can get access to the deployment package, we're good, right? Everything's fine. So then the question is, if it works that way, why do we need more than one deployment package? Well, in Config Manager 2007, the real reason for it was to try to minimize the size of your deployment package so that you didn't have to spend so much time copying the content across the network and updating the package and so on, right? And that was fine. But even then, in 2007, it wasn't such a big deal. Well, now in 2012, we've changed a bit, even on the distribution point side, to where it really makes the need for multiple deployment packages kind of a limited need situation, right? So when do you need multiple deployment packages in Configuration Manager 2012? Well, there's a couple that I thought through and come to mind. So if you have a deployment package, there was a discussion I was having a little bit earlier today with a customer where they described a scenario where their hierarchy basically serves workstations, but they do have responsibility for keeping a certain number of servers around them up to date with security patches. So instead of deploying the server-based security patches to the same deployment package that the workstation patches are in, they just maintain a separate deployment package for the server patches. And the result of that is the deployment package for server patches is a lot smaller, and then they just put it on select distribution points that are accessible by the servers. Whereas for workstations, they put it on all distribution points because there's a lot of workstations that need to come and get it, right? So it limits the impact to the environment in terms of disk space, in terms of moving content to distribution points, and so on. That's a great reason. It's a very valid reason, right? Well, another reason where you might want more than one deployment package is in terms of the number of software updates that you're managing with that deployment package. So in Configuration Manager 2007, we had a limit, not a hard-coded limit, but a supported limit of 500 software updates per deployment package. In Configuration Manager 2012, we've doubled that, and we now support up to 1,000 software updates in a deployment package. Well, if you think about it, whenever you to get to 1,000 software updates, it's going to take you a while, right? You'll get there maybe, but it's going to take you a while, especially if you do routine maintenance and make sure that the system's clean and so on. You'll take a while to get to 1,000 software updates. And then you can factor in if you need to continue deploying some of those software updates and so on. Maybe you add a second package at that time, whatever, right? So whether you have one, another thing that really factors into whether you have one or multiple is the fact that on a distribution point, we now support single instance storage. So whether you have the software update in one or both deployment packages, we're just going to store it one time on the distribution point because of single instance storage. So that argues against having perhaps the need for multiple deployment packages. I guess it makes it a moot point, right? Because whether you have more than one deployment package, whatever, you're still just going to have one instance of that software update on your distribution point, right? Other things that might play in there would be again, maybe content replication optimization to DPs. That's I can see that. It's probably not such a big deal, again, because of single instance storage and the optimization we get from the very beginning, even pushing out content in our distribution point. But nevertheless, that's up to you to decide. You can certainly do it if you want to. One thing to call your attention to, some of these I've already deployed, so they're already part of this deployment package. So, for example, these, let me find it. I know the Windows 8 ones are part of that deployment package. So if I go in and I want to deploy these again, in the early days of Configuration Manager 2007, let's see. Let me just go fake this out and work through it a bit. All right, so click Next. Oops, sorry. Hang on. Right, here we go, download, that's what I meant. So I can either select a deployment package that I have pre-existing, it's actually already in this one, these updates are, or I can always now go through and create a new deployment package, right? So it's pretty easy now. If I want to put a given software update or set of software updates in more than one deployment package, it's pretty easy. I can either choose a pre-existing one and put it in one or both of the pre-existing ones, or I can create a brand new one. It doesn't really matter. In the early days of Configuration Manager 2007, once the software updates were in a given deployment package, you didn't have this option again because of exactly what I described. The fact that it doesn't really matter what deployment package the update's in, as long as it's accessible by the client, we'll find it, right? But in some cases, again, as I described earlier, not all updates are on all distribution points in some scenarios. So you can now pretty easily go through and add updates to more than one deployment package. Where those deployment packages both are deployed to a given distribution point, we have single instance storage, so it's not going to take up any more disk space. But where we do have a difference in which distribution points get certain deployment packages, then we'll have it available where we need it, right? So anyway, belabor that point enough. Hopefully it makes sense, and we'll move on. Now, so last thing in this node really is automatic deployment rules. So while I'm here in software update groups, just a reminder of the way I broke this out. This is just an example, right? And the comment I made earlier was that it can be seen as a bit daunting, perhaps, to manually maintain all of these software update groups the way we're describing, right? And I agree, it is, unless you factor in automatic deployment rules. So I went through the UI on automatic deployment rules in part one of this. So I'm not going to go through it again, right? You can go through it if you want to see it. It's just basically giving you deployment options, kind of like a big template, if you will, for your options. But the point is, once you build automatic deployment rules, well, I'll show you. The properties of one here, right? So if I go to the Windows 8 security updates, I'm going to make decisions like what software updates I want to be factored into this. So if I want to build a Windows 8 security patch software update group, and I want this thing to be automatically populated and maintained as we go along with each patch cycle, it's really easy. The automated deployment rule will do that for me without even any intervention by the administrator. The only intervention you will need to do as an administrator is to take those patches that are from the previous month and move them into your maintenance deployment, and then let the new deployment be just for the current month. It's really easy using that edit membership tool, very, very easy to move software updates from one place to another, right? So with the advent of automated deployment rules, really makes it easy. So one of the things you can do with this is you can enable the automated deployment rule to create a deployment and enable it after the rule is run. I don't really recommend that you do this, at least at first, until you get comfortable. But if you want to let it automate the whole thing end to end, including deployment, you can absolutely do that, right? No problem. Okay, so I mentioned a couple of times that there is maintenance that will need to be done with these software updates, ongoing, monthly maintenance at least, to remove expired or superseded patches from active deployments, to maintain your software update groups, to move the previous month's software updates into the maintenance release so that you can prepare for the new software updates coming out, so on. So you can do that manually. It's really not hard to do manually. There's also some interesting automation that you can bring to bear to help with that. So I'm not going to talk about it other than a mention today, but it's going to be part of this series. I believe part 7 of the series will be to talk about how we can leverage something like Orchestrator or PowerShell or scripting, in general through PowerShell or VBScript even in some cases, right? I don't know exactly how I'll demonstrate it. Most likely just a combination of PowerShell and Orchestrator will get you pretty much everything you need, right? So I'll show you how you can bring those tools to bear to even further automate your maintenance every month, right? So we'll hit that later. Last thing I'll mention here is maintenance windows. So we've had maintenance windows for a long time, since Configuration Manager 2007. Coming in R2 is now the ability to have a separate maintenance window for software updates, and then set apart from your normal maintenance window, which might be for software deployments or whatever other activity you want to do on the client. So that's coming. Don't have it to show you right now, but it's going to be an additional option for you. All right, so let's pull the lab out and continue on a bit. Okay, so in terms of monitoring deployments, so we've got deployments going. We want to monitor the process of deployments. It's really easy to do it. There's actually some a monitoring node where you can monitor deployments really granular, easy to see. We also have reporting. I'll show those to you real quick, and we'll move on. Let me pull the lab back in. So if I want to monitor a deployment, then I can just simply go to deployments, and I'll see all the different types of deployments that are out there. I have applications, task sequences, program, whatever. Here's some software updates that I sent out. Haven't been cooking that long, but you already start to see a little bit of activity. So all of these really are currently in unknown status, those that are out there, right? So there's 3 in unknown and 6 in unknown and different things, right? But this is a great place to monitor your deployment. So your deployment's either going to succeed or fail. It could be not applicable, right, to the system, which is nice, because if you do have an update that you target to a system that doesn't need it, it's not going to factor it into the overall success rate because it doesn't need that deployment or that particular update, right? So, but I just show this to you because it's a really nice place to go and see what's going on. So for example, if I want to look at my status and look at what the unknown status is returning to me, view status to unknown, will tell me, hey, I've got a client that passed and is active. Now, it just, hang on, let me restart the console. There we go. Does that for every now and then in this environment for some reason. All right, let me go back to monitoring. So here we go, distributions. Here's my Windows 8. And let's go back in there. So unknown will tell me, hey, I've got an active client. There's one active, there's one inactive, and it'll tell me which one's active, which one's inactive, different things, right? So not a ton of detail there, but the point is, if you do have failures, it'll tell you why there's failures. If you have successes, it'll tell you that as well. If you have in progress status, it'll tell you that. So it's a good place to come and be able to see what's going on. Also reporting, there's a bunch of reports here. I won't go into all of them, but there are general categories of reports for software updates which are useful. So we have compliance software updates reports. These are the ones that you should use to describe compliance in your environment, right? There's a number of categories here. So there's deployment management, being able to manage the progress of a deployment, or look at what updates are being deployed or whatever, right? Deployment state. So I see sometimes folks use deployment state kind of as a compliance equivalent. It's kind of close, but it's not really a compliance report. These are the compliance reports. So scan reports and any troubleshooting reports, things that are going on, right? You can look at here. All right, so I'll leave these to you. The other thing I'll mention here is these reports are a great stage. If you want to build your own reports, if you want to build some really nice graphical reports to tell the story of your software update status, you can absolutely do that. We you can expose the internals of these reports through Report Builder. We do use SQL Server reporting services on the back end, so Report Builder looks inside these reports nicely, can give you a good head start, if you will, launching off point for how to customize these reports and so on. That's a topic of its own, so I won't go any further here, but at least to show, right? We pull the lab back out, and we'll move on. So the last thing that I really want to talk about is client settings, right? Configuring the client experience. And there are three big buckets. So the first thing is client settings. Client settings, the settings here really aren't new so much. The only one really new is the cloud distribution point. So the cloud distribution point really gives you just another option for a place that the clients can go to download content that you've made available to them, right? So I'll show you how to turn that on. You can make a decision if it makes sense for you. There's another switch, frankly, that might make more sense than a cloud distribution point in this scenario, because the cloud DP is a metered kind of connection. Let me just jump on down to deployment options, the allow fallback to Microsoft updates. I'll get to that in a minute. What that does, it's another thing that's new in Service Pack 1. On a deployment of software updates, there's a switch that will allow you to tell the client if it's trying to download an update, install an update, and we cannot get to our configuration manager infrastructure for whatever reason, but we do have internet connectivity, that it's okay to go retrieve that update from Microsoft Updates rather than just failing, right? We'll always try our infrastructure first, but in those cases where we can't get to it, but we have internet connectivity, we'll be able to go get it from Microsoft Updates. Just another way to increase your hit rate. Again, I think that's probably something that makes sense in most environments to turn on, especially where your clients can get to the internet. I'll show it to you in a minute. So deployment deadline reminders back up in client settings. I'll show you where to set that up. Again, it's not really anything new, and then the software update specific settings, not anything really new, but I'll show you where it is. In terms of the deployment options, in the deployment you can set some pop-up notifications and Software Center display options here, and so that will dictate the client's experience. And then finally, under other options, this is a client viewed item only business hours. I'll show it to you on the client's perspective. This is something you cannot configure on the site server, but it's worthwhile to know about because it does allow the client to have a bit more control, the user to have a bit more control over their deployment experience with ConfigMgr. So let's go look at those. All right, so back in the lab, let's start with client settings, right? So here I just have the default. Just run through where these things are real quick. So here's your cloud services, whether or not you want to allow a given user access to be able to use cloud services. Again, may not want to let every user have this. Requires that you have a cloud service like Intune, is one option for a cloud service, or the cloud DP as we're talking about here. whether you want to let the user have access to those. And then hand in hand with that is the ability to allow the use of a metered connection, right, for the device. That's where you set this. So this would be perfect for a customized client setting or customized user setting to enable or disable this option. Then we have the computer agent, which is where we configure the interval at which the user will be prompted to know that there's something to be done. You can put in your organization's name and various other things that are not necessarily software update specific, but these definitely impact software updates, right? And the user's experience with pop-ups and different things, notifying them there's work to be done, right? And then the software update specific settings are down here. So whether it's on or off. And then this one I'll just mention for a minute. Again, it's not new to Configuration Manager 2012, but it's worth understanding. So this option, the one that says when any software update deployment deadline is reached, just basically go ahead and install all the other ones too. So think about a scenario where you have a software update deployment whose deadline is going to be on Monday, right? Well, then you have another software update deployment whose deadline will be on Wednesday. And today it's maybe Friday, right? So what you can do is just let each one run on its own deadline schedule. So meaning Monday, then the user is going to possibly get disrupted, have the software updates deployed, maybe reboot their system. Then they come back up and they're working again, right? Well, then Wednesday comes around. They have the same thing happen. They're disrupted, the system reboots perhaps, and it just ends up frustrating the user. Or you could set this box and say, hey, Monday's coming anyway. We know something's going to happen on Wednesday, but instead of just disrupting the user twice, since Monday's deadline is approaching and is going to be reached, we're going to go ahead and factor in all the updates from Wednesday as well and just roll them together and do it at once. Right? That's what that option actually does. All right, so in terms of the deployment option, let's go look at that. Actually, get this closed. Here we go. So let's just look at the deployment options real quick. So go back to Software Library and look at one of my software updates deployments. Here, just pick the Windows 8 one, deployment. Go to Properties. A couple of things here. So first would be the user's experience in terms of Software Center and user notifications, whether I want to hide the updates in Software Center and hide all notifications, right? Meaning the user just doesn't see anything's coming, it just happens. Or if I want to display it all in Software Center, display all notifications, whatever, this will impact the user's experience whenever software updates roll out. The other one is download settings. So I mentioned the ability to download from Microsoft Updates. That is this option. It's set per deployment. To me, it's a good thing to turn on, right? It just has the effect of increasing your potential success rate. So that's this. Right? The last thing I want to show you real quick is Software Center. So this again is a client-side setting only. If I can type that right, Software Center, right? And specifically business hours, right? So business hours is set right here. The user has complete control over this. They can set whatever time frames and days they want. Basically what this is intended for is so the user can input what their typical business hours are on a given day, right? What this looks like, very similar to anyway, is a maintenance window. It's really not a maintenance window. The best way to illustrate how this is used is through a scenario. So let's say that we have a software update deployment, or any deployment for that matter. This is not specific to software updates. Software updates certainly will leverage this, but it's not specific. Let's say that we have just a software updates deployment, and we've configured it to go mandatory required on Friday. Well, maybe today is Monday, right? We're sending that deployment out. So the user is working on their machine. They see a notification that comes up, says, hey, there's new software updates to be deployed to your machine. And it's going to be required on Friday at a certain time. Well, maybe they're sitting here and they've been burned in the past and they've forgotten to close down applications on their machine. They've suffered through reboots, whatever, whenever the deadline reaches, and they don't want to do that anymore. So they've set their business hours, and they can see that the software updates are coming in. They can say, okay, it's Monday. I don't want to wait until Friday until this thing becomes required, because whatever you said as the administrator is going to be enforced on the client. but the user will have some impact to possibly install it ahead of that deadline. So they're working, it's Monday, maybe at 4 o'clock, their business hours end at 10 o'clock, right? And they say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and say, install this thing after my business hours are done. So they leave their machine up and running, close out of all the work they have to save and so on, and say go at 10 o'clock after my business hours. And so what ConfigMgr does is it then bumps up the required time to now like 10:01 p.m. or right at 10 o'clock. So as soon as their business hours, they get out of business hours, we start deploying that software update. Is it a big deal? No, because we're going to adhere to the requirements you set as an administrator. Anyway, the big deal is that the user now knows that it's coming, they can prepare for it, they can go ahead and proactively do it if they choose to. They don't have to, it just gives an option, right? So there you go, right? That's it. All right. So that basically closes out what I wanted to talk about in this session. The next session we'll go a little bit behind the scenes and see how these software updates get set up in the database, how they get deployed. So as we approach the next couple of sessions, what we're going to do on the server side is walk through all of the processing that needs to take place in order to get the client ready to deploy these updates. So there's kind of a divider. On the server side, we go through all the processes to prepare policy for the client to download and take action. So we'll go all the way through on the next discussion preparing policy for the client for software updates to download. Then on the deep dive on the client side, we'll actually take those policies and show all the way through how they get implemented on the client, right? So that's where we're going. Hang with us. We have a few more to go in the series, and we'll see you in part 3.